welcome to another installment of Janus Academy. This is the ninth in the series of our talks dedicated to historical analogies. Today we're talking about the connection between Neoclassicism and Analytical Cubism. So you've noticed that we've started this talk by comparing Romanesque art to Neoclassicism. Then we've continued through different eras. Now we came to Neoclassicism and we're comparing it to something that came after it. So Neoclassicism is in this particular regard the era that influenced, that spawned, if you will, another era, and that was profoundly important for it. We understand now with this lecture and with subsequent lectures to come that this is something that happens. A certain era is not only influenced by a previous one, but is also influential to the subsequent one. And we'll be getting through this a couple of more times. We can also say the same thing about the previous eras. We've started with Romanesque. Of course, this is by no means the first artistic stylistical formation that ever existed. We've had many different ones before. And we could have done the same thing about all of those before. And perhaps we're going to go back to those and we're going to cover them in the same manner. But let's go back to the topic at hand. So we have Neoclassicism on one end and Analytical Cubism on the other. Now, the main thing to begin with, something that is very, very apparent, is the question of deformation. This is something I want to talk about the most. This may seem as a bit of a surprising coupling because we see Neoclassicism on one end as incredibly sophisticated, elegant, elaborate, and we see it as a style that places tremendous value on technicality, on skill, on elaboration. A branch of Neoclassicism is called Academism here in France, and you can understand why. Academism really has a lot to do with the academy. When we say academy, of course, we're thinking about Academy of Fine Arts. But we're also thinking about academy as this institution that holds to eternal truths and beauties, that holds what is of the greatest quality for a certain society. So in many different cultures, we have this idea that if you become a member of the academy, let's say the Academy of Arts and Sciences, you have done basically most that you can do in your life. You have achieved immortal success and you have achieved immortal status. So becoming a member of the academy basically means that your work is of such high quality that it merits to be kept forever. It merits to be remembered forever. So academism and style goes after these values, and Neoclassicism is all about these values. Now again, Neoclassicism meaning classicism anew, meaning going back to the world of classical antiquity anew. And the reason why we want to go back to the classical antiquity is because we see those values as eternal. We see that kind of art as eternal. This is the only stylistic formation that is beyond dispute. We shall always hold this art in high esteem. So this is not something that we may change our minds about, as we have many different times in history. Now, this again may seem a bit surprising as a coupling because we're talking about this very high investment into everything that is eternal, beautiful, a type of art that necessitates a lot of skill, a lot of effort, a lot of exercise, a lot of practice. It goes without saying that an artist that will create in this style will have to have had academic education. So again, we go back to this idea of academy. So you have to be a trained painter. I don't think that I'm familiar with examples, though they probably do exist, of painters that didn't have an academic education, that didn't study at some sort of Academy of Fine Arts, but that were able to practice in this particular style. Again, they may exist only unbeknownst to me. The whole thing with this is that you apply a great amount of rigor, you apply a great amount of attention to detail, you polish your style endlessly, infinitely. So this is basically how this style is produced, and this is how its rigor is maintained. Now, when we're talking about Neoclassicism in France in particular, we are talking about the entire collaboration of many different institutions that seek to maintain this situation. So we have the salon on one end, we have the academy on the other. We have an entire network of galleries that perpetuate this situation. They truly want this to be the mainstream style, the face of French culture, at least when it comes to art and artistic production, especially visual arts. So on the other end, we have analytical cubism that we know belongs to the avant-garde, that belongs to modern art. It's highly experimental. At face value, you could look at Cubist paintings and say, well, these don't take a lot of time to produce at all. They're not terribly detailed. They are not terribly sophisticated. Quite the contrary. A lot of Cubist paintings are very much directly opposed to the notion of sophistication. They are trying to be quite brutal. They're trying to be direct, organic, all these other things. You could say that the most famous and the most prominent figure in style of Cubism is, of course, Pablo Picasso. And while analytical Cubism was just one of the different phases through which he moved as an artist, something that really defines him profoundly, more profoundly than Cubism, is primitivism. He was always a primitivist. And you could argue that this presence of primitivism is traceable and very evident in many other Cubist artists beyond Pablo Picasso. Now, another thing that is interesting about Picasso is that next to analytical cubism, he also had a period of his life where he was engaged in neoclassical painting. Now, these were not entirely comparable to Bouguereau or Ingres or David or other great masters of the era, but he did work in this style. He did have this whole idea of going back to tradition, rediscovering tradition. He wanted this to be a part of his canon. This was always a very important thing for Picasso. Even when he was creating in Cubist style, he had this strong connection with the European tradition, strong connection with Greco-Roman context, especially with Greek myth. We may get to talk about it some other time. But this is something that helps us to start unraveling this connection. So not only Picasso is famous as a Cubist, he has some very famous paintings of his done in style of Neoclassicism. Because again, we said Neoclassicism lasted all up until World War II. And this was not terribly surprising to see painters, let's say, active in the 20s and the 30s of the 20th century be engaged in this style in its later stages. Decadent, you might argue, stages. Now, we want to go back to something that brings these two styles together. So we said that there are many differences, especially when it comes to technicality, technicity, technical skill, rigor, etc. But there is something that brings them together, and this something is the notion of deformation. Both of these styles, especially when it comes to Ingres, somewhat less when it comes to Bouguereau, but Ingres really are very, very invested in deformation. Now, this is something that has to do with stylization, how you stylize what you represent. In many cases, we're talking about a human figure here. So you want to stylize things to make them prettier. This is a staple of Neoclassicism. If we are talking about analytical cubism, not necessarily the case. We know great many analytical cubist paintings that are not necessarily invested with the ambition of achieving beauty. You might argue quite the contrary. But this is the idea. You heavily stylize what you represent, and you stylize them in a certain direction. So stylization is always, to a certain extent, deformation. And Ingres truly is the great master of this. He starts deforming and shaping his objects, especially human bodies, especially female bodies, in a very peculiar manner. So this is something that brings him very close to a lot of cubists, to a lot of proto-cubists as well. So he starts to, in a certain way, simplifying the bodies that he is representing and considerably deforming them. So he goes back to this idea presented by Raphael, one of his great influences, one of the great masters he looked up to. And he goes back to this statement that when you want to achieve beauty, you are not thinking about the model in front of you. You are not after faithful reproduction. You are truly after an idea. Beauty is an idea, and so you are achieving beauty, and you are doing this by basically trying to imprint this idea into the matter that is in front of you, regardless if the matter that is in front of you happens to come in human form. So you want to imprint the idea of beauty into the human body, and in order to do that, you want to shape and you want to deform, truly transform the human body. Now, Ingres is a great artist, one of my personal favorites, if not my personal favorite. And what makes him so interesting is an aspect of his painting, aspect of his art that connects him to Picasso, is that he had a very layered and very complex understanding of beauty. So he wasn't truly trying to achieve beauty in a superficial manner, something that is pleasing to the eye. No, beauty in Ingres' version of things was very, very layered, was complex, and went in very unexpected directions. So you could argue that a lot of Angra's paintings, the best ones at least, are made in such a manner that they could be seen as beautiful and absolutely hideous, monstrous even, at the same time. So we are looking at a painting that looks absolutely amazing but is monstrous at the same time. One and the same painting, one and the same figure presented on that painting. How is this possible? Well, it all has to do with deformation. So we're going to go back to this a bit later. If you look at Picasso's works of art, you could say that what makes him famous is his tendency and capacity to melt human figures, to melt faces. Not just faces, entire bodies. So this tendency that he had to completely deconstruct the human body, and again, especially the female body, and to make it appear in a very unexpected manner. So Picasso was very, how should I say, explorative and very curious in this regard. So his entire career is spent in finding and inventing new different ways in which he can deform and transform the human body. So one of the most important aspects of Picasso's career is something we call biomorphism. So this tendency that he wants to shape new possible, or rather impossible, bodies and to make them anew. So to invent in a way different ways in which the human body can exist. Now, it's important to address, talking about analytical cubism, that we are not dealing with abstract art. This is a very important thing to understand. So no matter how much deformed the objects get to be in analytical cubism, they always are objects. We are still dealing with figurative, representative painting. And this is important when we're talking about Angra too, because Angra deals with things that are recognizable. We're not talking about abstract art. This is a completely different development that comes out of a completely different line of reasoning. And we're going to get to that because abstract art is incredibly important for the entire 20th century. So here we are talking about deformation, about stylization of already existing things. And so we understand that their talents were faced in this one same direction, both neoclassical talents and analytical cubist talents. We, of course, take Angra and Picasso as, I would say, the most representative examples of this. We'll try to mention other people too, but we'll mostly be talking about these two. So what is the deal with this whole idea of deformation when it comes to Angra? Well, it has a lot to do with general French culture, and it has a lot to do especially with the accumulation of French culture as it happened centuries before neoclassical style. It has a lot to do with this idea that French culture is profoundly influenced and shaped by a Cartesian school of thought, by René Descartes, a very famous philosopher. And his take that cognition, intelligence, reason is the measure of humanity. It's the measure of all things that we are interested in as humans. So it's this idea that things need to be reasonable, which also means spiritual rather than corporal. In this worldview, you can say that what you try to do is you try to always impose reason upon the world. And we go back to this Hegelian idea that art is all about spirit wrestling with matter, spirit trying to impose itself on matter with more or less success. Now, this is something that you can see present in many different aspects of French culture. So you, for example, visit the city of Paris, you decide to go to Versailles, and you understand that in Versailles, you see a very peculiar take on gardening. So Versailles is very famous for its gardens. This is something that made it famous back in the day. So you see that gardening in Versailles, but also a lot of Parisian parks too, is all about cutting the plant into a geometric shape. So it's not about presenting a certain plant beautiful as it is in its own right, as God made it, arguably, but no, it's making it beautiful. So this is the idea that you have to impress your own notion of beauty onto the existing world. So you take a bush, you say this bush is only potentially pretty. I have to achieve this potential. So like Michelangelo said famously, I saw an angel in stone and I set it free. So this is the work of the artist, to set free the angel, not only out of a stone, but also out of a bush, out of a shrub, out of a tree, and many other things. So you will see something that I can never get used to. This is something that is completely foreign to my sensibilities, is this idea that we should cut trees into cubes. We should cut canopies and tree branches into forms of cubes. I don't understand this, but it doesn't really matter. Many people find this pretty, obviously, because many people like Parisian parks, and many people find Versailles to be absolutely amazing. But the idea stays the same. So you have divine creation or a process of natural formation, it doesn't really matter. You don't find it pretty. You have to make it pretty. So you make it pretty through essentially violence, because when you cut the plant, I don't think the plant appreciates that very much. So basically, you're cutting the plant, you're conforming it into your own vision of beauty, and you're imposing your own vision of beauty upon it. So the same way as we deal with gardening here in France, Ingres deals with human bodies. Now, you could say that it's not just Ingres. Truly, the entire French fashion was all about compressing the human body, squeezing it into a certain form, imposing the notion of beauty upon a human body. And again, a corset is a very good example of this. We mostly associate women with corsets. Men also wore them, but not that important. You could say that if you wear a corset, you're basically squeezing your body into a certain form. And if you go and try and do that really hard, sufficiently hard, you will damage your internal organs. You will inhibit yourself from breathing properly. You will not be able to move properly. But it doesn't matter. What happens inside your body doesn't really matter. If you make permanent damage to your internal organs, it doesn't matter. What truly matters is that you are presentable. Whatever is on the surface is what matters. So we have this idea that not only in art, but truly in real life, we are willing to deform our bodies so as to make them pretty, because they have to be conformed to this idea of spiritual beauty. And this is very French indeed. This notion that beauty is spiritual in nature and that it's not corporal. So corporeal, natural, material world cannot be beautiful by design. Again, if you adopt this particular point of view. So natural world is something to be honed, something to be perfected, something to be worked upon. And so when you work upon a human body, when you apply heavy makeup, when you wear a very large wig, when you wear clothes that completely deform your body, this is what makes you beautiful. Artifice makes you beautiful. Hence, we go back to this whole idea of art, which is the root term out of which we developed the notion artifice. So it's this notion that you have to work upon the human body and make it completely artificial if you want to make it pretty. So this is what Ingres is dealing with. And he is, I would argue, the greatest proponent of this, but also the greatest critic. And this is where it gets really interesting. This is how we see a complete and a fully formed connection between analytical cubism and neoclassicism. So you could say that Ingres, in this particular regard, but many other neoclassical painters too, Bouguereau to a certain extent, have this idea that they, at the same time, in a form of a double bind, present a notion and dispute the notion. So what do I mean by this? We need to go back to the example of Kant and Hamann, the two famous frenemies that were seen as pinnacle of enlightenment. Now, it really depends on how you want to see Hamann in this particular case. Someone who thought, very briefly again, that humans are not guided by reason, so he was the anti-Cartesian, if you will. He posited that humans were guided by passions, by impulses, by things that were hard to, rather impossible to explain, and impossible to understand. So he saw humans as making decisions driven by impulses. And you know, he was possibly right about this. Many psychologists argue that we are always driven by our emotions, that we have emotional capacity to make decisions, and then we can later rationalize them intellectually, but it's never our intellect that makes a decision. I don't want to get into this dispute. I'm just putting it out there as a possibility. This is not a definitive attitude. And we're not talking about psychology here. We are talking about Hamann. So the idea is that Hamann, at the same time, is seen as someone who aggressively disputes the heritage of enlightenment, but is at the same time possibly the pinnacle of enlightenment. So this is what I'm trying to get here, that we have one and the same figure who disputes the era to which, at least chronologically, he belongs to, but is at the same time the pinnacle of this era. And so this is something that we come across in many, many different instances, this notion that the pinnacle and the zenith of a certain era already carries the seeds of its destruction. It's already working upon its deconstruction and its dismembering in a way. So we could say that on one end, the Enlightenment, that was all about the light of spirit and light of reason and education and all these lofty ideals, would insist that liberty of speech, liberty of thought was a very important thing. Well, if you get liberty of thought, you also get liberty to question everything that you just said. So it's like this idea, okay, we're going to question everything, we're going to apply scientific method, we're going to apply reasoning. Well, then we can question everything that goes with it. We can question the very method of questioning itself. And this is something that takes us then to Romanticism, that we said that Hamann was very important for. This whole idea of questioning everything and constantly shifting perspectives that we're going to be talking about when we get to talk about Schlegel and other people. So the idea is that Angra, as well as to a certain extent Bogoro, is seen as the pinnacle of neoclassical movement, because not only that he achieves, I would argue, technical perfection and expressive perfection, not only that he achieves utmost elegance, he also basically plants the destruction of this entire system. He presents us with impossible bodies. He presents us with impossible deformations, some bodies that cannot exist. Literally, that would be physically, well, not only terribly painful, but yes, yet again, impossible. Now, the great example for this is the, I would argue, most famous painting by Angra, the Great Odalisque. So we have a woman who is naked, who is young, who is beautiful, in a very rich, luxurious setting. So we can see some symbols of wealth around her, silk and satin. We can see fur, jewels, opium dispensers. So everything is made to convey the idea of luxury. And we see a naked, attractive, beautiful young woman in the midst of all of this. Well, this is only if we look at the painting superficially. If we continue looking at the painting, we start understanding more and more that there is something deeply wrong with this young woman. So we understand that her anatomy is completely off, that her back is curved in a very unnatural manner, that she has 3 vertebrae more than she is supposed to, that she would break her spine in 2 places if she were to bend this way, so that her neck also is bent in an unnatural and impossible manner. She would literally break her neck if she were to hold it like this. And we have many other details to substantiate this point. So if you look at her arms, if you look at her breasts, if you look at her feet, the way her legs are situated, we see this is all incredibly wrong. And the more we look at this painting, the more we discover just how wrong it is. But, and this is the main point, it's still beautiful, and this is so amazing. So you look at this monstrous apparition that is impossible to exist, or at least alive, and you say everything is wrong about this, but it's still incredibly pretty. It truly is beautiful. And what Angra makes us discover by this, and I say again, Bogoro and other, David, not that much, he makes us discover that there is more to beauty than what we see. He makes us understand that beauty is a very layered phenomenon, that beauty invokes a lot of violence. This is something that we mentioned, and we shall mention it many times again. Now, why do I constantly talk about violence and beauty? Not only that, let's say, a beautiful person inspires a lot of jealousy around themselves. This is just one very banal example, but in this particular French view of things, beauty literally necessitates violence, because again, we need to remember that beauty is something that is achieved. So think about the plant. You cut the plant down to be pretty. So you're exerting violence over this plant. If you look at your body, even if you don't want to wear a corset or makeup or wigs or what have you, let's say you want to keep your body fit, you want to maintain your body in great shape, you want to achieve aesthetics, so you have to work out, you have to be careful of what you eat, you have to exert a certain discipline in your life, you have to sleep properly, it's a whole thing. So you need to introduce a lot of discipline in your life, and discipline always is a form of violence, because you say, okay, I really want to eat a bunch of cookies now, I want to eat a lot of chips. No, I have to deprive myself. Deprivation is a form of violence that you exert onto yourself. So the whole idea is that beauty seen in this particular manner, I'm not talking about absolute beauty, I'm talking about beauty seen in this particular form and in this particular cultural context, necessitates a lot of violence, whether you exert it onto yourself or onto others, like when you cut the plant. So this is what Angra is suggesting. He is suggesting that beauty invokes not only violence but also monstrosity, and so he goes full circle, where he represents something that is downright, I wouldn't say hideous, but troubling is the real world. Now, is the real word. So we go to Picasso. This particular aspect of Angra's work helps us understand all of Picasso and all of Cubism, because Cubism is all about deconstructing what we see. Now, we see the seeds of deconstruction planted in deformation present in neoclassical style. So we go to analytical cubism and we see that this is what it's all about. It's about deforming, deconstructing, simplifying. Now, you could argue that all of neoclassicism is about simplification. It's this idea that the simpler your work of art is, the better it is. The simpler your physiognomy is, the better it is. So these artists went to great lengths of trying to purify their thoughts, to trying to purify their technique. And the idea of less is more is nowhere to be more found than in neoclassical styles. So the notion is that if you complicate things, if you make them complex, if you make them layered, this is because the purity of your thought is not enough. So you need to purify your idea. Any great idea, so would argue neoclassicists, is essentially pure and simple. And this is the hardest of all of things to achieve. When you're talking about drawing, when you're talking about composition, when you're talking about pretty much anything, simplicity is the highest ideal. So you look at analytical cubism, you see that it's all about simplifying things. It's the very technique. The idea being that you want to represent, let's say, a human body, to stick with this example, in a simplified manner. You want to understand it geometrically. So you apply a lot of math. We go back to this whole idea that we presented previously, that God is a mathematician. Many people adopt this. So you want to understand the human body, and you want to make other people understand the human body in this manner. So you represent it as a series, as a combination of geometric forms. And this is how we call the whole thing cubism, because we deconstruct two cubes, not necessarily just cubes, but we deconstruct into geometric bodies. And that's the whole affair. So you might ask yourselves, is why would we attempt to deconstruct into geometric bodies? And the answer would be very similar to the answer we gave when we spoke of Impressionism and how it was influenced by invention of photography. In this particular case, we have invention of two important things. One is the camera, but I mean this time a film camera, and the other one is jazz music. So we have these two coming together to bring forth analytical cubism and to profoundly shape its very existence. So you could say that Impressionists were dealing with photography when they were creating their style, when they were interested in light. When Neo-Impressionists then got all scientific about light and how it works and how it moves, and is it a wave, is it a particle, all those things. So we have a next level challenge presenting itself to cubists or to artists in the beginning of the 20th century, when films become a broadly available thing. So now you have this form of art that represents moving images. How do you deal with that? How are you going to rival moving images when we know that paintings and statues, most other visual forms really except the cinema, are static by design? If you create a painting, it's not going to be moving. It's not made out of parts. It's a static media. How do you deal with it then? Well, you want to basically take an object and be able to present it from all of the possible perspectives at the same time. So you want to make an object seen from all of the points of view. And not only all of the possible perspectives, all possible point of views, but in all of its actions. Let's say that we have a lot of Cubist paintings about people playing the guitar or the mandolin or any other instrument. So if you take this as the subject of your painting, you not only want to see this person playing a guitar from all of the angles at the same time, but what you want to do is you want to see them in all of the movements they make as they play the guitar. So you want to present basically a synthesis of this entire action. And the way to do this is to basically deconstruct the figure that you see, to simplify it, to break it down to its elemental, cubes, for lack of a better term. You can think about Lego cubes. It's like basically giving a lot of Lego cubes to someone, and then that someone is to play with them and to reconstruct this image in their own mind. Now, why do I make a comparison between this and jazz music? This is a very profound, very deep connection. The whole idea of jazz music, as I understand it, you feel free to correct me in comments if I'm wrong, is that you are given morsels, you are given fragments of sounds, really of music that is created by musicians that communicate between themselves. And they tend to play around with sounds, they tend to play around and freestyle with music. So then, as the member of the audience, you truly partake in what they're doing. You pick up morsels that they create and then you recombine them yourself, and then you enjoyed that music properly. Now, this is why many people could not really understand jazz. It's kind of a difficult thing to understand because it's very fluid. It doesn't have a stable form. It's not a standard musical language as was previously the case with some other musical forms. So this is something that necessitates your engagement as the audience. So you have to be, to a certain extent, musically inclined yourself, or to a certain extent musically literate, not to say musical, so that you could get this type of music. And it's not always easy to get. Sometimes it's downright impossible. The whole idea is that your participation is required. You have to come forth and you have to basically invest an effort if you want to properly enjoy this. So it's the same thing with Cubism. You look at the Cubist painting and you see that a certain body is deconstructed, decomposed, simplified into its basic elements. So then you have to pick those elements up and play with them and make something out of that painting. So you have to partake. You cannot just be a passive enjoyer. You as a spectator, you become a part of the creation of this entire work. And this is the whole idea that, again, this simplification, this tendency to simplify, is really taken from Neoclassicism. You could argue that it exists in Renaissance already. It's taken as this haughty aesthetic ideal that was then basically given to everyone. It was given to the masses. This whole thing with analytical cubism is that it's decidedly not as elitist as Neoclassicism is, or is elitist in a very different manner. So you could say that while analytical cubism painters and authors would not require you to know great many references from classical antiquity, they would not require you to know the symbolism of this object or that plant or that bird. They will require you to make an effort and to basically understand some fundamentals of painting, or in the case of jazz, music. So we could say that there is an even more concrete example of a visual connection between these two styles, and it really has a lot to do with color. It has a lot to do with the attitude that was prevalent in Neoclassicism, and that attitude is that drawing, illustration, is far more important than color. So Angra had an entire theory built around this, is that drawing is the structure, is the fundamental of the painting. So everything is about drawing, and colors for him are to be simple and to be subdued. So if you look at his art, you can see that it's clearly very linear, that drawing is a more important aspect. But not to say that colors are less important, they are important in a different manner. The whole idea is that he sought simple colors. Now, this is something that we can then trace as an influence. This is the attitude that influences people like Degas, it influences Cézanne immensely, then later influences Matisse, and then later influences, Picasso, Braque, and many other Cubists. So this idea that you want to use a simple field of color, that you want to simplify things in this regard as well. And you can say that this is especially important when it comes to Cézanne, because Cézanne is a proto-cubist in a way. He basically laid out the foundation for analytical cubism. If you're looking at what Cézanne has done with his work, he was, again, simplifying things that he saw. He was simplifying. He was trying to make a painting with the least amount of surfaces possible. So if you were familiar with video games in the 90s, as I was, you were familiar with a phenomenon that we called low poly, so low polygonal three-dimensional figures. This notion that back in the day we had computers that were limited with their hardware, graphic cards that were limited with their processing power. So if you wanted to have a 3D game, you needed to create objects and people that had limited amount of surfaces, so limited amount of polygons. And then we would have these stylizations. Let's say if you remember the first Tomb Raider game or many others, you would have a very stylized person that would be made out of triangles, and it was very boxy, and it's kind of funny and endearing. Alone in the Dark is a very early example of this. So it's this idea that you want to bring down the number of surfaces as much as you can. And you can see how this whole proto-cubist and cubist idea, again, influenced some aspects of our technology, in this case, video game design, much the same way that pointillist paintings influenced the creation of pixels. So there's a very interesting connection between technology and ideas that come from the world of arts. Now, this is what Cézanne was basically trying to do. He was trying to create low poly characters, low poly world. And if you look at his paintings, you can see that he is really investing a considerable effort in representing things that are recognizable, but that are given to us with the least amount of surfaces possible. And if you go through the genesis of Cézanne's work, you see him going from sort of impressionism, but not really, towards essentially cubism. So you see that the last works that he's done are clearly deconstructed into a small amount of surfaces, and they're deconstructed into geometric bodies, literally. So cubists really take after this. And a very important aspect of this is how you deal with color. When you look at analytical cubist paintings, you look at very reduced color palettes. You don't really look at explosion of colors. This is not impressionism. So you look at paintings that are oftentimes almost monochrome. So a lot of Braque is vaguely gray-ish in a way. And a lot of Picasso done from this period is the same. So you are not really looking at rich, vibrant color palette. You're not even looking at strong contrasts of colors, as is the case with Fauvism. No, you're looking at very reduced colors that are obviously subdued and are obviously there to not overpower drawing, which is the most important aspect. So design, the structure that holds the painting. And so we can see how Ingres really drives this idea in his own right, and how analytical cubism is a development of a certain trait of Ingres' art. And I'm saying Ingres, I'm really thinking Neoclassicism. I'm taking Ingres as the greatest example for this particular style. So if you look at the intermediary stages, if you look at how Degas treats lines and how he treats colors, you can see that Degas is also a disciple of Ingres in a way. And he was very open about this. He stated Ingres as the most important influence that he's ever received. And he absolutely privileges drawing and design to actual color work, which again kind of makes him not really impressionist, but not to get into that topic, we may talk about this some other time. So there's another aspect of neoclassicism that I would say is not that present with Ingres, so let's leave him alone for a moment, but is really present with David. So this whole idea of monumentality and rigidity. So if you look at David's paintings, you can see that they're very rigid. Now, you could argue that this was a lack of talent. I wouldn't say this personally. Or you could argue that it's a conscientious decision that he's made to create this sort of artificiality. Again, we go back to artifice being the most very important aspect of all of this. And a certain type of imposition. If you create rigid objects or paintings, you are truly representing power. You are representing something that is kind of frightening, really, but certainly impressive. You think about all of Egyptian art, you think about their statues, even hieroglyphs, they're very, very rigid, and there's a specific reason why they're given that way. Not that it was the lack of artistic talent, far from it. It was a conscientious decision to make something appear important and downright sacred. So if we're talking about David, especially if we're talking about his mythological paintings or paintings that speak of glorious moments in human history, like let's say King Leonidas at Thermopylae. This is a very large painting you can see in the Louvre Museum. Or when we're talking about the paintings that depict the actual Roman history, Brutus receiving bodies of his sons, for example, or mythical Roman history, the fight between Sabinians and the Romans, women interrupting the fight between Sabinians and the Romans, or then the Sermon of Horatius. These are the stories from mythical history of Rome. You can see that all of these are very rigid, monumental, glacial to a certain extent. And you can see the same thing present in Cubism. So you can see that for all this dynamism that Cubism is aiming to represent body and movement, a lot of these paintings appear very, very rigid, especially when it comes to Picasso, especially when it comes to how he depicts women, basically as if they were mountains. So many different examples of Picasso's paintings where women are these colossi that move in a tremendously rigid and stiff manner. And again, this is to invoke a very specific sentiment. So we can make an entire series of courses on Picasso's misogyny, or something that we perceive today as misogyny. His very troubled relationship with women and how he posited women. But one of the ways in he saw women was that he saw them as these absolute beasts, forces of nature that had very little spirit, very little personality, very little intellect, but they were these tremendously powerful sexual, material beings. Again, not that we agree with this. This is what Picasso taught. Now, I would like to continue elaborating this in a very peculiar manner. I would like to talk about animality and atavism that is present in these paintings, especially Cubist paintings. So this whole idea that you're trying to better understand the human being, you're trying to better understand not only appearance of a human, but also its character, also soul, if you will, spiritual aspects of humanity. All of these things you achieve through simplification. So through simplifying a certain being, you get to better understand it. And you get to reduce that being to its very basic components, to its very fundaments. And you can see that this is really what the entire early 20th century was all about. You can see that people like Freud and many other psychologists, many other anthropologists were trying to understand humanity. I mean, the entire science of anthropology is all about this. And the way to do it is through simplification. Many early anthropologists dealt with very binary worldviews. So this is how we have the famous divisions, famous dichotomies. Not to get into all of that. So the basic point here is that through simplification in analytical cubism, you not only understand the appearance of the human body, you not only better understand how to present, how to draw a human body, you understand human character, human soul much better as well. And so what this means is that if we reduce humanity down to its very essence, down to its very core, we get to the fact, I would say biologically and indisputable fact, that we are animals. And that we are mammals. So very complex mammals endowed with a lot of reason, with a lot of spiritual qualities, but animals nonetheless. So these people were very invested in rediscovering humanity. This is what happens with the entirety of the 20th century. Again, it has to do with the Industrial Revolution. It has to do with us being afraid of machines, us being afraid of becoming machine-like. So we go the other way. Those that do, we go in the organic direction, and we want to rediscover, actualize, and bring to the surface this aspect of humanity that has to do with carnal, that has to do with fleshy, that is also erotic and sexual and sensual. It basically has to do with the animal. So a lot of analytical cubism is about representing the human animal, if you will. And if you look at Picasso, you see numerous examples of this. Not only that he depicts women kind of as animals, sorry to say it, it's just a fact, I'll get back to it, but he is fascinated not only by animals, he has many different paintings and statues of goats and of bulls and of horses, but also with mythical figures like the Minotaur. This is a staple of Picasso's canon. This is the staple of Picasso's entire expression. He is eternally fascinated by the Minotaur. And what is a Minotaur other than a hybrid creature that's half animal, half human? So arguably, we have this whole idea that is much, much older than Picasso or Cubism or Neoclassicism or really all of our civilization, that we can equate certain traits of our character to particular animals from the animal kingdom. This is the reason why all of Greek gods, for example, gods of the Greek pantheon, all had their animal counterparts. Apollo, for example, was a field mouse, very interestingly. Ares was a wild boar. Aphrodite was a dove. Zeus came as a bull, but also came as an eagle. Many of these gods have more than one animal. So you could say Athena famously came as an owl, but earlier incarnations of Athena spoke of a mare. So she had to do with the worship of the horse, and etc., etc. So this whole idea is that animals, certain animals, carry certain traits. You know, lions are courageous, foxes are cunning, and the rest of it. So if you see this trait in certain humans, you say, oh, he is a lion. The whole Rastafari thing is about lions, people who carry their dreadlocks so as to appear as lions. So they want this lion energy inside them. They, as humans, they carry this animal energy. So you could say that this is very present in European history, deeply present. This totemistic idea that we connect ourselves to animals. And Claude Lévi-Strauss analyzed this in his own manner by analyzing the emblems of very old aristocratic houses of Europe that would carry certain animals on their, emblems on their shields, and that would equate themselves with those animals. So they carried the characteristics of those animals. So Claude Lévi-Strauss argued that entire tribes back in the day would associate with a certain animal. This animal would be prohibited to eat. We would leave it alone. We would not actually just leave it alone. We would, in fact, study it and trace it and analyze it, and we would try to organize our entire lives, both personal and communal, by studying this animal, by mimicking its example. So there's a very deep connection with animals here. And you could argue that when Picasso is presenting women as animals, again, he's doing this for his own reasons, but he's also doing it as a part of this very, very large, very deep tradition, not just European, that we equate ourselves to animals. You know that Egyptian gods all are animal-human hybrids. They're presented either with animal heads or downright entirely animals. So it's this idea that is very present in Neoclassicism too, not just in analytical Cubism. It's very easy to say that Picasso, being a primitivist as he was, and many other painters around him, wanted to reduce humans to their animalistic nature. They wanted to do it challenged with the Industrial Revolution, but it's not just that. It has much, much deeper roots and antitheses. So you could argue that when Picasso presented the Minotaur, a very important, next to the bull, a very important presence in his work, he was truly trying to deal with his own sexual nature, with his own very aggressive and imposing sexual nature. So he basically saw himself as the animal. He equated himself sometimes to the bull, sometimes to this creature that is half human, half bull. So it's the idea that we see not only deeply animalistic urges in humans being equated to animals, we also see that divinity too comes in animal forms, which is the case in shamanism and with totemism, and which is the case in all of these examples that we previously discussed. So this is why Greek gods all have their animal counterparts. This is why they sometimes appear as animals. Famously, Zeus kidnapped Europe in the form of a bull. So he transformed himself into an animal. So there's a very deep connection here. And when analytical cubists are equating the characters they depict as animalistic, they're doing it so that they could analyze traits of humanity, so that they could connect us to the organic world, so that they could react against the Industrial Revolution, and so that they could better understand what humans are all about. So this is a very layered initiative. It's not just saying, oh, we are very simple, basic, organic machines, if you will. We are nothing but animals. So it has a very important and very layered spiritual dimension too. Now, if you look at this in terms of Neoclassicism, you can see, I will put an image as an example, an image by Gérard François Pascal Simon, so Cupid and Psyche. Of course, tremendously neoclassical painting, very beautifully made, impeccable composition and color harmony, and of course drawing. Everything is well made here. The thing I want to turn our attention to really is this whole idea of animal wings. Now you can compare this to Canova and a very famous statue that you can again see in the Louvre Museum of Cupid and Psyche, and you can see that in that statue by Canova we see wings of Cupid being of the same color as the rest of his body, and it's all white obviously. So it all comes together in a seemingly flawless manner. In this particular case, you can see that these wings are not the same as his body. These wings belonged to a bird. And we see a difference between feathers in those wings and the rest of his body. So it's not all brought together smoothly, as was the case in marble that Canova used. This makes us think of animalistic nature of these highly spiritual entities. So we have this famous story from antiquity, Cupid and Psyche, or Amor and Psyche. It doesn't really matter. It's this whole idea that when you fall in love, you basically are kidnapped by Cupid. You are no longer you are no longer reasonable. You're no longer rational. So your very soul has departed. And there is something downright animalistic about all of this. Now, this is quite interesting because we're talking about spiritual aspects of all of this, and we're talking about the very notion of the soul, the psyche, being the outmost spiritual notion. But we are talking about this creature that is depicted as half animal, half human, or half divine rather, having a bird's wings, being a half animal. And this is not that it's half divine, half animal, it's actually that it's fully divine, but fully divine means being half animal. And again, we go back to Greek gods, and we go back to Mesopotamian gods, Egyptian, Babylonian, Assyrian, etc., being depicted as, being half human, half animal. So this is a very important thing to understand, is that this very lofty ideal, something that we see belonging to the classical world, therefore, almost by definition, we see it as eternal truth, eternal beauty. We see the perfect human body basically coming in pair with birds' wings. And you can see the same thing in one of the most famous statues in the world, Nika of Samothrace, also in the Louvre Museum, that it's a divine entity, it's a goddess of victory that has wings of a bird. You can see the depiction of Ishtar, the queen of the night, comes with talons and with bird's wings. So we see many different Sumerian gods having horns as a sign of divinity. So we see that there's a very strong connection to the animal world, and it's present in Neoclassicism, again, as a very lofty ideal, as the notion of eternal beauty and truth, and is then deconstructed in a certain manner, brought down to earth in Analytical Cubism. So what I'm trying to say here is that when Picasso depicted his mostly women, but also sometimes men, as animalistic, as raw, as angry, as downright grotesque, he was too seeking divinity. He was going back to looking at gods as having to do with the animal world. And he was arguing that all of these impulses are not lowly in nature. They're not base. They're not banal. They're actually divine. It just depends how you define divinity and how you define animality. And we have many different examples from the field of Cubism, again, not just Picasso, where we equate this simplicity, this animal presence, this strength and raw power that comes from simplicity, we equate it as something that is divine. Because we argue that back in the day when people still actively partook in paganistic beliefs and paganistic idea of the sacred, this is how they saw things. So I would like to bring in another reference that is dear and important to me personally, and it perfectly fits with this entire conversation. And this is the French thinker, writer, anthropologist, many different things at the same time, Georges Bataille. So Georges Bataille has this incredibly influential study called eroticism, erotisme. I think it's translated as eroticism. So in this study, he presents many, many interesting ideas. I heartily recommend you read it. And amongst other things, he presents this, I would say, very Bataille-esque vision of a woman, how Georges Bataille understands women. So he argues that a perfect woman should have a very beautiful face that is very attractive. So you are immediately attracted. You see this beautiful face. It's like, oh, this is amazing. But then, by definition, so says Bataille, women have incredibly ugly genitalia. So if you look at the entire genital apparatus of a woman, you are naturally disgusted, you are repulsed, you see it as monstrous, you see it as... Yeah, this is really funny. Not that we necessarily agree with this, but this is just how he presents it. So he argues that beauty in its complexity, in its full and complete form, needs to have both of these. It needs to have a beautiful face of a woman and then absolutely horrendous genitalia, again, of a woman. And so he argues that beauty as a notion is only truly complete And therefore, erotic attraction is only truly complete when we have beauty and horror act at the same time. So if you just see a beautiful face and genitalia is not downright horrendous, you're not doing it right. Also, on the other end, if you just have horrendous genitalia and not a beautiful face, you're also not doing it right. Now, what he's trying to argue here is something that brings us back to Angra and his take that beauty is monstrous and, well, beautiful at the same time, so that we don't have beauty without monstrosity. This is what he's trying to say. And if we're looking at Picasso, we can say that sometimes it seems that his entire vision of the world is exactly like this. He doesn't really introduce as much beauty as Angra does. He mostly veers on the grotesque and on the repulsive. But the point is there that beauty is done by Picasso only in a very peculiar manner. And this is something that has to do with both of these styles, with both of these schools of thought, if you will, is not only that beauty always depends from violence, it always depends from monstrosity. Truly, it has to encompass both. It has to have both. And this is why Picasso would create a lot of Madonnas, a lot of Venuses, a lot of just women, basically as hideous, monstrous, deconstructed entities, because there is this, how should I say, generally accepted idea that if we deal with paintings, if we deal with history of art, with statues as well, we are, for a larger part of it, trying to represent beauty. We are dealing with something that is beautiful. This is how we want things to be. When we go to any museum in the world, we will mostly see pretty things, unless the museum deals with, let's say, 20th or 21st century art. But there are very specific reasons why this is the case, and we'll address them later. So you could say that for a long period of time, people were trying to achieve beauty. This was their goal. Now, I would argue that Picasso never stepped away from this goal. He, too, was trying to achieve beauty. He was inspecting beauty as a notion from different angles. And I would argue that the only way in which we can truly understand his endeavor and what Cubists were trying to do, again, simplifying, etc., is if we address the roots of this initiative, and roots of this initiative are situated in the era of Neoclassicism. So, I hope that this connection makes sense. Yet again, I think as I have this impression that I didn't really sufficiently said about this. There's a lot more to be said, but we have already exhausted our format of an hour, so we have to stop here and perhaps come back to it sometimes later. We didn't really address the details, how feet are dealt with by most Cubist painters, that this is a really important thing, how faces are dealt with. We'll do all of these things some other time. So I thank you for your attention. I hope this made sense, and I hope to see you again soon. Ciao.